The Last Men by Frank Belknap Long, Jr. Maljoc had come of age. On a bright, cold evening in the fall of the year, 50 million years after the last perishing remnant of his race had surrendered its sovereignty to the swarming masters, he awoke, proud and happy and not ashamed of his heritage. He knew, and the masters knew, that his kind had once held undisputed sway over the planet. Down through dim eons, the tradition, it was more than a legend, had persisted, and not all the humiliations of the intervening millennia could erase its splendor. Maljoc awoke and gazed up at the great moon. It shone down resplendently through the health prism at the summit of the Homorium. Its rays, passing through the prism, strengthened his muscles, his internal organs, and the soft parts of his body. Arising from his bed, he stood proudly erect in the silver light and beat a rhythmic tattoo with his fists on his naked chest. He was of age, and among the clustering homoriums of the females of his race, which hung suspended in the maturing nurseries of Agrahon, was a woman who would share his pride of race and rejoice with him under the moon. As the massive metallic portals of the homorium swung inward, a great happiness came upon him. The swarming masters had instructed him wisely as he lay maturing under the modified lunar rays in the nursery homorium. He knew that he was a man, and that the swarming masters were the descendants of the chitin-armored, segmented creatures called insects, which his ancestors had once ruthlessly despised and trampled underfoot. At the front of his mind was this primary awareness of origins. At the back, a storehouse of geologic data. He knew when and why his race had succumbed to the swarming masters. In imagination, he had frequently returned across the wide wastes of the years, visualizing with scientific accuracy the post-Pleistocene glacial inundations as they streamed equatorward from the poles. He knew that 4 of the Earth's remaining continents had once lain beneath ice sheets a half-mile thick, and that the last pitiful and cold-weakened remnants of his race had succumbed to the superior sense endowments of the swarming masters in the central core of a great landmass called Africa, now submerged beneath the waters of the Southern Ocean. The swarming masters were almost godlike in their endowments, with their complex and prodigious brains, which seemed to Maljoc as all-embracing as the unfathomable forces which govern the constellations. They instructed their servitors in the rudiments of Earth history. In hanging nursery homoriums, thousands of men and women were yearly grown and instructed. The process of growth was unbelievably rapid. The growth span of the human race had once embraced a number of years, but the swarming masters could transform a tiny infant into a gangling youth in 6 months, and into a bearded adult, strong-limbed and robust in 12 or 14. Gland injections and prism ray baths were the chief causal agents of this extraordinary metamorphosis. But the growth process was further speeded up by the judicious administration of a carefully selected diet. The swarming masters were both benevolent and merciless. They despised men, but they wished them to be reasonably happy. With a kind of grim, sardonic toleration, they even allowed them to choose their own mates. And it was the novelty and splendor of that great privilege which caused Maljoc's little body to vibrate with intense happiness. The great metallic portal swung open, and Maljoc emerged into the starlight and looked up at the swinging constellations. 500 feet below, the massive domed dwellings of Agrahon glistened resplendently in the silvery radiance, but only the white, glittering immensity of the Milky Way was in harmony with his mood. A droning assailed his ears as he walked along the narrow metal terrace toward the swinging nurseries of the women of his race. Several of the swarming masters were hovering in the air above him, but he smiled up at them without fear, for his heart was warm with the splendor of his mission. The homoriums, sky promenades, and air terraces were suspended above the dwellings of Agrihan by great swinging cables attached to gas-inflated, billowing air floats perpetually at anchor. As Maljoc trod the terrace, one of the swarming masters flew swiftly between the cables and swooped down upon him. Maljoc recoiled in terror. The swarming masters obeyed a strange, inhuman ethic. They reared their servitors with care, but they believed also that the life of a servitor was simply a little puff of useful energy. Sometimes, when in sportive mood, they crushed the little puffs out between their claws. A chitin-clad extremity gripped Maljoc about his middle and lifted him into the air. Calmly then, and without reversing its direction, the swarming master flew with him toward the clouds. Up and up they went till the air grew rarefied. Then the swarming master laid the cool tips of his antenna on Maljoc's forehead and conversed with him in a friendly tone.
"Your nuptial night, my little friend?"
it asked. Yes, replied Maljoc. Yes, it is. He was so relieved that he stammered. The master was pleased. The warmth of its pleasure communicated itself to Maljoc through the vibrations of its antenna.
"It is well,"
it said.
"Even you little ones are born to be happy. Only a cruel and thoughtless insect would crush a man under its claw in wanton pleasure."
Maljoc knew then that he was to be spared. He smiled up into the great luminous compound eyes of his benefactor.
"It amused me to lift you into the air,"
conveyed the master.
"I could see that you wanted to soar above the earth, that your little wingless body was vibrant with happiness and desire for expansion."
That is true, said Maljoc. He was grateful and awed. He had never before been carried so high. The immense soaring wings of the master almost brushed the stratosphere. For a moment, the benevolent creature winged its way above the clouds in rhythmic glee. Then, slowly, its body tilted, and it swept downward in a slow curve toward the sky terrace.
"You must not pick a too beautiful mate,"
cautioned the master.
"You know what sometimes happens to the too beautiful."
Maljoc knew. He knew that his own ancestors had once pierced the ancestors of the swarming masters with cruel blades of steel and had set them in decorative rows in square boxes because they were too beautiful. His instructors had not neglected to dwell with fervor on the grim expiation which the swarming masters were in the habit of exacting. He knew that certain men and women who were too beautiful were frequently lifted from the little slave world of routine duties in the dwellings of the masters and anesthetized, embalmed, and preserved under glass in the museum mausoleums of Agrihan. The master set Maljoc gently down on the edge of the sky terrace and patted him benevolently on the shoulder with the tip of his hindermost leg. Then it soared swiftly upward and vanished from sight. Maljoc began to chant again. The galaxy glimmered majestically in the heavens above him, and as he progressed along the sky promenade, he feasted his gaze on the glowing misty fringes of stupendous island universes lying far beyond the Milky Nebula to which his little race and the swarming masters belonged. Nearer at hand, as though loosely enmeshed in the supporting cables, the pole star winked and glittered ruddily, while Sirius vied with Betelgeuse in outshining the giant cloud-obscured Antares and the wheeling fire chariot of planet Mars. Above him, great wings droned, and careening shapes usurped his vision. He quickened his stride and drew nearer and ever nearer to the object of his desire. The nursery homorium of the women of his race was a towering vault of copper on the edge of the cable-suspended walk. As he came abreast of it, he began to tremble, and the color ebbed from his face. The women of his race were unfathomable dark enigmas to him, bewildering shapes of loveliness that utterly eluded his comprehension. He had glimpsed them evanescently in pictures. The swarming masters had shown him animated pictures in colors, but why the pictures enraptured and disturbed him so he did not know. For a moment he stood gazing fearfully up at the massive metal portal of the Amorium. Awe and a kind of panicky terror contended with exultation in his bosom. Then, resolutely, he threw out his chest and began to sing. The door of the Amorium swung slowly open, and a dim blue light engirded him as he stood limbed in the aperture. The illumination came from deep within the Homorium. Maljoc did not hesitate. Shouting and singing exultantly, he passed quickly through the luminous portal, down a long, dim corridor, and into a vast rectangular chamber. The women of his race were standing about in little groups. Having reached maturity, they were discussing such grave and solemn topics as the past history of their kind, and their future duties as obedient servants of the swarming masters. Without hesitation, Maljoc moved into the center of the chamber. The women uttered little gasps and cries of delight when they beheld him. Clustering boldly about him, they ran their slim, lithe hands over his glistening tunic and caressed with fervor his beard and hair. They even gazed exultantly into his boyish gray eyes, and when he flushed, they tittered. Maljoc was disturbed and frightened. Ceasing to sing, he backed away precipitously toward the rear of the chamber. "Do not be afraid," said a tall, flaxen-haired virago at his elbow. "We will not harm you." Maljoc looked at her. She was attractive in a bold, flamboyant way, but he did not like her. He tried to move away from her, but she linked her arm in his and pulled him back toward the center of the chamber. He cried out in protest. "I do not like you," he exclaimed. "You are not the kind of woman—" The Amazon's lips set in hard lines. "You are far too young to know your own mind," she said. "I will be a good wife to you." As she spoke, she thrust out a powerful right arm and sent 3 of her rivals sprawling. Maljoc was panic-stricken. He pleaded and struggled. The woman was pulling him toward the center of the chamber, and 2 of the other women were contending with her. Suddenly, the struggle terminated. Maljoc reeled, lost his balance, and went down with a thud on the hard metallic floor. The metal bruised his skull, stunning him. For several seconds, a wavering twilight engulfed Maljoc's faculties. Needles pierced his temples, and the relentless eye of the Amazon burned into his brain. Then, slowly and painfully, his senses cleared, and his eyelids flickered open in confused bewilderment. 2 compassionate blue eyes were gazing steadily down at him. Dazedly, Maljoc became aware of a lithely slim form and a clear, lovely face. As he stared up in wonderment, the apparition moved closer and spoke in accents of assurance. "I will not let them harm you," she said. Maljoc groaned, and his hand went out in helpless appeal. Slim, firm fingers encircled his palm, and a gentle caress eased the pain in his forehead. Gently he drew his comforter close and whispered, "Let us escape from these devils." The woman beside him hesitated. She seemed both frightened and eager. "I am only 8 months old," she told him in a furtive whisper. "I am really too young to go forth. They say, too, that it would be dangerous, for I am—" A blush suffused her cheeks. "She is dangerously beautiful," said a harsh voice behind her. The instructors here are indifferent to beauty, but when she goes forth, she will be seized and impaled. You had better take me." Maljoc raised himself defiantly on his elbow. "It is my privilege to choose," he said, "and I take this woman. Will you go forth with me, my little one?" The woman's eyes opened widely. She looked slowly up at the Amazon who was standing in the shadows behind her, and said in a voice which did not tremble, "I will take this man. I will go forth with him." The Amazon's features were convulsed with wrath, but she was powerless to intervene. Maljoc was privileged to choose, and the woman was privileged to accept. With an infuriated shrug, she retreated farther into the shadows. Maljoc arose from the floor and gazed rapturously at his chosen mate. She did not evade his scrutiny. As Maljoc continued to stare at her, the strained look vanished from his face, and mighty energies were released within him. He stepped to her and lifted her with impassioned chantings into the air. Her long hair descended and enmeshed his shoulders, and as he pressed her to his heart, her arms tightened clingingly about him. The other women clustered quickly about the exultant couple, laughing and nudging one another. They examined the strong biceps of the bridegroom and ran their fingers enviously through the woman's dark hair. Maljoc ignored them. Holding his precious burden very firmly in his muscular arms, he walked across the chamber, down the long outer corridor, and out through the massive door. Above him, in another moment, the cyclopean luminous cables loomed beneath far glimmering stars. He walked joyfully along the sky promenade, chanting, singing, unquenchably happy in his little hour of triumph and rapture. The woman in his arms was unbelievably beautiful. She lay limply and calmly in his embrace, her eyes luminous with tenderness. Orion gleamed more brightly now, and the great horned moon was a silver fire weaving fantastically in and out of the nebula-laced firmament. As Maljoc sang and chanted, the enormous droning shapes above him seemed mere alien intruders in a world of imperishable loveliness. He thought himself now as lord of the earth and sky, and the burden in his arms was more important in his sight than his destiny as a servitor, and the benefits which the swarming masters had promised to bestow upon him if he served them diligently and well. He no longer coveted the slave joys and gratifications. He wished to be forever his own master under the stars. It was a daring and impious wish, and as if aware of his insurgent yearnings, a great form came sweeping down upon him from out of the sky. For an instant it hovered with sonorously vibrating wings in the air above him. But Maljoc was so obsessed with joy that he ignored the chill menace of its presence. He walked on, and the woman in his arms shared his momentary forgetfulness. The end of their pathetic and insane dream came with a sickening abruptness. A great claw descended and gripped the woman's slim body, tearing her with brutal violence from Maljoc's grasp. The woman shrieked twice. With a harsh cry, Maljoc leaped back. As he shook with horror, a quivering feeler brushed his forehead and spoke to him in accents of contempt.
"She is too beautiful for you, little one. Return to the Homorium and choose another mate."
Fear and awe of the swarming masters were instinctive in all men. But as the words vibrated through Maljoc's brain, he experienced a blind agony which transcended instinct. With a scream, he leaped into the air and entwined his little hands about the enormous, bulbous hairs on the master's abdomen. The master made no attempt to brush him off. It spread its gigantic lacy wings and soared swiftly into the sky. Maljoc tore and pulled at the hairs in a fury of defiance. The swiftness of the flight choked the breath in his lungs, and his eyes were blinded by swirling motes of dust. But though his vision was obscured, He could still glimpse dimly the figure of the woman as she swung limply in the clasp of the great claw a few yards above him. Grimly, he pulled himself along the master's abdomen toward the claw. He pulled himself forward by transferring his fingers from hair to hair. The master's flat, broad stinger swung slowly toward him in a menacing arc, but he was sustained in his struggle by a sacrificial courage which transcended fear. Yet the stinger moved so swiftly that it thwarted his daring purpose. In a fraction of the time, his brain grew poignantly aware that the stinger would sear his flesh before he could get to his dear one, and the realization was like a knife in his vitals. In despair and rage, he thrust out his puny jaw and sank his teeth deep into soft flesh. The flesh quivered. At the same instant, the master swooped and turned over. Maljoc bit again. It screeched with pain and turned over and over, and suddenly, as it careered in pain, a white shape fell from its claw. Maljoc caught the shape as it fell, with one hand clinging to the hair of the master's palpitating abdomen and the other supporting the woman of his choice. He gazed downward into the abyss. A mile below him, the unfriendly earth loomed obscurely through riven tiers of cirrus clouds. But Maljoc did not hesitate. With a proud, exultant cry, he tightened his hold on the woman and released his fingers from the hair. The two lovers fell swiftly to the earth. But in that moment of swooning flight that could only end in destruction, Maljoc knew that he was mightier than the masters. And having recaptured for an imperishable instant the lost glory of his race, he went, without fear, into darkness.